also can historically tie to many of the cases that I'll cite later. Then we'll talk about challenges and opportunities, and we'll open it up for Q&A. So again, this is Black History Month. So this is pictured here is the Freedom's Main Line of 1870 and 18 through 1871. And this is an access case. This is with regards to three African Americans in Louisville, Kentucky, who had paid their fare and entered the trolley. And they were asked to leave and not to ride. You see, they allowed African American women during the work week to actually ride in this trolley, but men of color, Black men, were never allowed to ride it. And so, in a protest, three Black men, two of them were brothers, joined and got onto the trolley. They were subsequently asked to leave by the trolley driver and then surrounded by other trolleys and subsequently kicked and sent to jail. So, in the midst of this, there were 300 African Americans who were around the trolley at the time, watching what was going on. And as you see, there were racial slurs and everything. It was just simply a case of access. But what happened as a result of this is that they actually ended up desegregating the trolley line as a result of this because of all the bad conduct. So sometimes there's conduct that can actually lead to progress, and in this case, this is one of them. And there are many, many cases with regards to access that, transportation and context has always been a part of the civil rights movement. So examining the role of transportation in society, we know this for sure, that number one, it's about mobility. We want to ensure that we're moving people and products at all time throughout the system. We want to ensure that that supply and demand are met in our marketplaces. So interstate commerce is important as well. It also serves to connect economies. As long as there's access in some form or fashion, whether it be a roadway or transit, it connects economies. It connects people to jobs. It connects people to services. It builds communities. Communities are built around access to transportation, whether it's a highway system or a bus system or a rail system. Commuters are actually connecting into many areas because there's transportation available. And of course, workforce development and tourism is very important as well. Okay, sorry, I don't know how to work the pencil. So I spoke to you a little bit earlier about transportation and civil rights, and remember it's the context of the time. And I just wanted to cite some of the things that has historically shaped what transportation as an industry looks like. It also shaped the laws that that got us to where we are now and had an impact on things that happened previously. So our very first transport actually was the maritime system that allowed for the transport of enslaved people from Africa back and forth from 1619 in Jamestown to 1808. We'll also look at 1850, which is the Fugitive Slave Act. And this was passed by Congress on September 18th of 1950. And as a result of slaves or enslaved people being here, it was a part of the Compromise of 1850. And this act required that slaves be returned to their owner, even if they were in a free state. So the act also made it illegal for any African American, technically, if they were to not get caught, if they were to get caught, to have to go back to the land where they were enslaved or to a state where they were enslaved. And that was a part of our systemic, that was an act, it was a law in Congress. And so it moves on to say that we're beginning to see the building and the foundation of systemic practices of discrimination. And those are the parts that need to be broken down. In 1857, Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a man who moved to Missouri. He was enslaved and had moved to Wisconsin as well. His child was actually born in Wisconsin. And in an effort to become free, he went to the Supreme Court. And the decision that was Scott versus Sanford indicated that no matter where you were born, once a slave, always a slave, because you were not a citizen. So therefore, you did not have the rights to enjoy life under the Constitution at that time. So again, this is the context of the time. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a landmark decision of the US Supreme Court because it ruled that racial segregation and laws did not violate the US Constitution just so long as you provided separate but equal accommodations. And as we know, that went on well into the 60s. And then finally, the transportation was a central theme in the Freedom Riders campaign in the early 60s, where John Lewis was a young freedom rider and attempting to exercise his constitutional right for interstate travel. And of course, we know what happened there with the 22 Greyhound buses that were attacked and burned in 1961. But nevertheless, we began to see policy shape in the 60s as transportation was used as a vehicle for social justice. So just going back to transportation in the early 1900s, I wanted to provide you with a concept of what transportation looks like and why equity will begin to play a part in it. If you look at this photo here, and if you're able to look at it very carefully, you will see multiple forms of diverse transportation. You will see that there are vehicles that are in play. There's a cable car. There are people that are walking about. There's even a motorcycle in there and bicycle. So at this time, we're beginning to see a collision of all this diversity when people are using these various forms of transportation to get around. It becomes a problem specifically with the automobile because the automobile is much larger and it's much faster and it moves about. And so as automobiles become more popular, safety became a main concern. You began to see accidents, you began to see deaths as a result of auto collisions or buggy collisions. Because you see at this time, you would have been on a roadway possibly with someone who was on a horse-driven carriage or and it was very common to see that. And even in Pennsylvania today, we have many communities in the Lancaster area and throughout who are involved in collisions. Their buggies are involved in collisions with vehicles. So you can imagine during this time where horse and buggies were even more common, but the car became more popular as well. And then finally, as we move on to advanced transportation, we begin the industry, the transportation industry, meaning the auto industry, began to realize that safety was a major concern. They were not going to stop building cars. What they were going to do is to ensure that there was some level of practice on safety on vehicles. And because their goal was to sell as many cars or to sell as many vehicles as possible, touting that it would have an impact on advancing economic development, but mostly interstate commerce. So here goes the Eisenhower interstate system. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was a goal to eliminate all the unsafe practices of transportation by building a more efficient system where people could actually travel across the country. You see, this connects states, it connects people, it connects opportunities for interstate commerce and tourism. So the goal was to actually to build the interstate highway system. And how they were able to do that is that in I want to say 1929, they were actually able to collect gas taxes from each state. This was authorized by, it was 1939, I'm sorry. It was authorized by Congress that states could collect a 1 cent tax on each vehicle that gassed up at any of the fuel stations. So that became a way in which they could fund such a massive project, such as the interstate highway system. It was a massive infrastructure package. And of course, it was built also to create jobs, very similar to the infrastructure bills that we're looking at or we have looked at in the past. It also was created to commit to building 41,000 highway lanes across the country, which means there would have been a tremendous impact on economic development in terms of workforce, job availability, and also once these systems connected, it would be seamless and allow for seamless travel, which consequently would allow for additional automobiles to be sold as well. The goal originally of the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System was to serve to connect 42 state capitals, which they did very successfully. I just want to note also, because we are in Pennsylvania, that the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission is the oldest turnpike in the country, if not in the world. I don't know if you all knew that or not, but our system was built in 1940. So we actually predate the Eisenhower interstate system. We're also one of the largest systems in the country as well, with over 553 miles of roadway. So it's interesting to say that because this was a federal system, it was not funded by the same system as the highway system is today that we typically enjoy. The turnpike, even though it is an interstate highway system, it is not funded by the federal government. It is mandated to be self-funded. So because we predated the system, we're probably one of the only interstates in the country, maybe it's one more, that is considered an interstate highway as well. Just a little food for thought there. So this system was really important. But again, if we're looking at the context of the time, we began to know that in the 1950s and 60s, we know that was going on. There was a system, there was these social inequities that were a part of our system that were already there. So the effort was really at that time, it was post-World War II, there was a push to really rebuild the economy. We also know that in the 50s and 60s, there were systemic practices in housing and access, such as redlining of devalued properties in Black and Brown communities. Why that's important is because if the properties are devalued as a result of redlining, it was an incentive for highway developers to come in and purchase it at a much lower price, also deeming and then tying some of it into urban renewal, which identified areas that were considered slums, and ultimately literally bought property at pennies of the dollar, pennies on the dollar. Also, because this is in typically poor Black and Brown communities, there was lack of access, lack of political opposition. It was easy for the taking, so to speak, for the most part. It really created a path of least resistance. So many parts of the transportation equities with regards to building that interstate highway system, which went through 42 states, which often had an impact significantly on Black and Brown communities, were also systemically broken up. Economies were broken up. Small businesses lost their abilities to thrive, and many people lost their homes and were never able to recoup. And ultimately, those collective neighborhoods were never able to recoup themselves. What you're looking at here is North Nashville. And I brought this up because there is an effort here. I didn't want to show it without showing the immediate effort here. If you look at the center of the page here, you will see where there is an interstate highway going directly through a neighborhood that is considered, it was a thriving African American community. But there is a mayor there by the name of John Cooper who wants to mitigate those past practices and look to reconnect both sides of those communities together. So you see, there are efforts in place to ensure that we are reducing those past or mitigating those past practices of discrimination. And I just wanted to show you this here. But as you see, this community has never really thrived again. And so they're looking to revitalize it. I think that's a greater part of what they're wanting to do. But in any case, they're wanting to reconnect the communities. And it looks like a pretty old highway. So I'm not sure how they plan on doing it, but there's some plan in place. And he's been talking about it. So impact and outcome. Robert Bullard is a sociologist. He wrote a book called Highway Robbery. He talks about the impacts on discrimination, systemic discrimination with regards to building the interstate highway system. And he points to three things that are important to recognize. Number one, he directs procedural inequities to those transportation decisions that may or may not be carried out in a uniform, fair, and consistent manner because there was not a diverse community available or diverse stakeholders were not involved in the decision making. He also talks about geographic inequities, as we spoke earlier, with regards to, two areas: housing, slums, areas that are perceived to be low in value, redlined areas, specifically with African Americans and Latino people in it, where properties were devalued low. So in terms of land use and land grab, they were perceived to be of higher value to route a highway system through because there was less of a value in terms of what their community meant to them. And then, of course, social inequities, where we talk about benefits and burdens. Oftentimes, highways, again, using the path of least resistance. I couldn't really point to one specifically, but I'll show you one in a little bit, where they actually are able to divert highway systems away from wealthy communities, with the purpose of wealthy and influential communities being those communities that would benefit from it, whereas they do not share in the burden that many Black and Brown communities suffered. And many of you, if you are of age and if you really think about it, if you think about what surrounds you in terms of your highway systems and all, you will see that there was significant disparity into where highways were actually built. And you could actually see the remnants today of those highway systems as they, in your communities. And particularly if you're Black or Brown, if I could see you, I would say probably raise your hand, and probably most of you will say that you've seen some level of quote unquote progress go through because of interstate highway and progress. sorry, I have a new computer, so I never know how to use a mouse any other day, but this doesn't, this is even worse. So again, it's all about the cost of progress. What's the end game here? A lot of this is not intentional. A lot of this is unintentional because remember, the highway system was based on one thing. It was based to get automobiles out of some communities, get them on the road, get them in a way where they're contributing to our economy, we're utilizing, we can sell more cars. So the cost of progress in transportation was high for some of those communities. There was a disparate impact on Black and Brown communities. It stemmed from what we didn't know at that time, because remember, the process was to develop highway systems that were more efficient, more accessible. And so those practices also mitigated environmental concerns that, you know, we know now have been deafened, and there are consequences to it. Lots of concrete, impervious surface that leads to flooding, noise pollution, health impacts. We know that many communities now have a culture of health concerns such as asthma, especially in children. Children are the number, are children in urban areas tend to go to the hospital more and die from asthma more than any other disease um, that is available. Job access. Remember, the cost of progress was to impede it. Some people benefited from the access to the highway systems. Others were actually closed and shut down, where major organizations decided they wanted to be closer to systems, so they moved out of areas that were now dismantled as a result of highway going through them. Historic neighborhoods destroyed and dismantled. Disproportionate investment in highway development in Black and Brown communities meant that they lost a lot of their business and a lot of tax dollars in that community. And then, of course, finally, social distancing, particularly in urban areas where there's lots of concrete, lack of access to shopping, food deserts, so to speak, and even access to viable parks with grass in it. So defining transportation equity. So transportation equity now is at the forefront of what we've done after those practices went into place, where everyone began to see that there was a need to correct some of the actions that happened during that major period of progress. So we identified transportation equity as how do we create systems, prepare systems, repair systems where there's an equitable distribution of resources, that there's equity in benefits, that the cost of programs still are not necessarily maximized, but programs and services are available for people, not based on their income or their influence, and their ability to choose. That's very hard because we know in a society like that, that's a challenge, because often those that do have the most influence will make a decision to decisions typically are swayed their way, so to speak. But transportation equity, in its definition, is designed to mitigate those past practices, to understand that those past practices happen, just as we talk about redlining, just as we were in the program a couple of years ago, ED Laster, when you brought on Richard Rothschild, he talked about those systemic practices. As long as we know they exist and we can talk about it, we can mitigate past practices on those projects that tended to dismantle those communities, primarily with people of color or poor people or vulnerable and those who had less political access. So the concept of transportation equity is to ensure that there is that we are looking at fair and balanced ways at all times to ensure that transportation planning includes all people. So again, this is Black History Month, but I wanted to give you an example of this parkway here. This parkway may be familiar to some of you. I want to say this is in Westchester County, but don't quote me on this. But Robert Moses was an urban planner, and he began this project in New York during the 1920s. So on each side of the roads here, you had your Black and you had your Latino communities. And it was to make the way for this parkway that went through it. And he was so gun ho on ensuring that it was only made for automobiles that he built the bridges purposely. If you see, there's a bridge there in the back. He built it purposely so it would not have access to public transit going through it or buses at the time. So it was exclusively for vehicles. And some may say, and some do say, that it was just low enough to keep the city buses from accessing these parks and carrying poor minorities from passing underneath so that they can go into other communities on the other side of this roadway. So that's an example of access denied. Oftentimes, you don't see a lot of practices that were mitigated specifically on racism. Most of racism and discrimination is intentional, unintentional in terms of highway practices. But again, it connects to the context of the time. What did we think about the communities that we didn't live in? So why is this important to know? So I want to focus just real quickly on these communities here. So transportation is really important for all of us because 80% of federal funding coming into any city or any urban center is for transportation purpose. That is the reason why equity has to be at the forefront, at the core of everything that we do. However, 86% of white people still live outside of the cities. So you see that there's a shift there. So if 80% of all the money is going into the urban centers, but the majority of people live outside of the cities, there's a disparate impact in terms of what's going in there. 70% of Blacks and Latino live in the cities or in the inner suburbs that surround the city. And I mentioned earlier that the number one cause of hospitalization and death of children is living in urban centers or cities is asthma. Imagine children dying. That's the number one cause of death in them. And commutes are higher for people who live in cities. So even though these cities look like major epic centers, these over here that are at the bottom here, those are not. And so therefore, Black women who tend to be the head of household in many of these communities tend to have an average of an 80-minute more commute per day than a white woman going to a job. So we talk about impervious surfaces. Impervious surface for most of you is just concrete. It's surface that does not take in any water. So oftentimes these communities were subjected to flooding. These are some of the practices that we realized later in terms of inequities. So 75% or more of impervious surfaces, you have very little water that is not going into tributaries. However, any small bit of ground cover that includes grass and trees not only protects communities from flooding, but it also clears the air of all the pollutants because in inner cities, there's lots of cars, there's lots of transit, lots of emissions going around. And we'll talk a little bit about how transit is mitigating it as well. Finally, the challenges of impervious surface also is that in many of these communities, there are a lot of dead ends. This is actually a picture from the women of Brewster's Place. And I wanted to put that there because often highway systems sectioned off communities because there were highways on the other side of it. So that access was denied to many people. But it also caused pulls to happen too in terms of flooding if there weren't any trees or any ground swells to capture to water. So ultimately, at the end of the day, all of the impervious surfaces that the challenges of impervious surface actually really looked at how water was entering into tributaries such as our rivers and our bays and how pollutants were therefore entering into them. So now we look at equity and solutions in transit. So there are 4 ways that the Kinder Institute identifies 4 forms of equity to apply to transit. And so transit, and really this form of equity could really be applied in any form, but they look at 4 different ways. And we had talked about what equity didn't look at. But number 1, the distribution of how we are applying the same standards to all communities. Are we evaluating what safety looks like, what emissions look like, the availability and service in all communities? Procedural. Can everyone contribute to the outcome of transit services? Is there engagement? Are we able to connect with all communities so we can hear their voice, to hear what they want to know? Is there outreach that is allowing us to reach every single person in the community where they are? 3 is structural. Who holds decision-making power? Is there representation reflective of the communities that they serve? Do we have people that are in engineering positions or public outreach professionals? Are they representative of transportation? Do they represent the community that they serve? And then 4th, restorative equity. Is it just? Do we look back? Are we using our ethics and integrity when we're making decisions? Are we evaluating those past practices, those inequitable funds and policies in low income or less politically engaged community? How do we make the effort to have restorative equity where people are a part of it because we recognized previously that they were not a part of any of these decisions that impacted their communities? So briefly, I wanted to look at some of the policies that we're looking at now. After 1964, there are many practices with regards to transportation, many that you know about and many that you don't. The first, obviously, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that is Title II, Title VI, and Title VII. Title II just simply state that there's some injunctive relief against discrimination in places of public accommodations, that you simply could not discriminate against anyone on the basis of race, color, or national origin in any program. So that knocks out the separate but equal doctrine. Title VI is the program that states that on the grounds of race, color, and national origin, that you cannot be excluded or denied the benefits subject you to any discrimination that is receiving federal financing assistance. Much of transportation, for the most part, is predicated on where that location is. So for example, as long as any road is being funded minimally by a federal practice or any federal financing, you have access to it. So oftentimes we are able to tie transportation or tie roadways to access to stores, to access to public accommodations. And we're able to do that only because of transportation, highway systems, and roadways that are 80 to 90% funded, but there's always something that connects them to it. So it's really it is a catalyst for ensuring that we all have access to the best of our ability. Another program is that you're all familiar with is the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. It's a program designed by the United States Department of Transportation. That program is to provide assistance to business owners that historically were denied opportunities to participate in transportation projects before. So there's a certification program. There's also DBE supportive services. And there's also ways in which businesses can participate through a goal setting process that is mandated by the U.S. Department of Transportation on federally funded projects. Another thing that we look at with regards to policy serving transportation equity, we looked at the grander scale. We look now to see that much of this impervious surface runoff has run into our lakes and has polluted our rivers and tributaries, most notably going into bays that impact fresh wildlife and impact other species that typically would not have been impacted by this environmental shift as a result of runoff and pollutants going into it. So the National Environmental Policy Act is one of those acts that supports that. Also, the Americans with Disability Act of 1990 to ensure that there is accommodations for those that have disabilities. That's very much a part of transportation programs, particularly with sidewalks and ensuring that sidewalks are safe for people that are not able to or are not mobile without the assistance of a device. The Clean Air Act, wetland mitigation, any project plans that we do with regards to highway systems or even building transit systems or construction is there's typically a wetland mitigation study that is done to examine and evaluate the environmental impact of the communities that we're looking to either build or to expand. These are on federal contracts as well. And then, of course, there's a commitment to community impact and public outreach as well. And in Maryland and some other states as well, the National Historic Preservation Act, the last agency I worked for, they actually had an archaeology department because of all the historical artifacts and the historical things that had happened in Maryland in the more denser areas. And so they would actually do archaeology studies in those areas. That word always good. So spoke to you a little bit about the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. Time is a little slow, so I'm not going to play the video that I wanted, but I did say that it was about DBE certification, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise certification. Those that are considered disadvantaged are those that fall under the protected category. So those are with regards to race and gender, and all the categories that have been historically denied opportunities to participate. There's a small portion of the Disadvantaged Business Program that does take special consideration for people that do not fall into that category, most notably what you will recognize in Pennsylvania is our Appalachian communities, because they are considered disadvantaged because they have been historically denied opportunities. So as we look at equity as a practice, many organizations have looked at how do we analyze when there's equity and the importance of it. So this is some of the 3 steps that they use. They use policy. There's a commitment to equity, design practices, and operations. I will say for the most part, an engineer, when they're going from point A to point B, they're really not taking a lot into consideration. So most of it has to be done prior to them designing. So that there's minimal impact on the community. So that's where it's built in, where there are built-in cushions to ensure that equity is in place. There's outreach opportunities to reach out to the communities. There's evaluations, there's reach out to municipal planning organizations, regional planning organizations. Many of those organizations, there's these checklist of things. And then we look at things such as what type of impacts would it have? What is the social class, the income class of the communities that we're looking into? What do we need to look at? What does universal design look like? How do we design a program that impacts everybody? We also look at the impacts in terms of safety, because remember, safety is still a major factor in building and expanding roadways. We look at the cost, the impacts, congestion, look at crash rates. We also look at economic impacts. It's on the same line as safety now. We also look at regulations and enforcements. We also look at the density to the measurement, the density of the communities. Obviously, if there's more people per capita, then obviously there is going to be a greater impact on the community with travel and design decisions. And then finally, demographics, income class, ability, geographic location, the modes of transportation that we're trying to accomplish is also taken in consideration as well. So these are just samples of what could be used, particularly that are used by many organizations to apply an equity analysis to any design project that they may build in the next 5 or 10 years. So I want to talk to you just quickly. We only have a few more minutes. I'm going way over, but I'm going to finish up on this. Talk about what we're trying to do in the community as well to ensure that equity is there, because equity also means allowing for green space. What are we doing to mitigate sidewalk repairs? So that people who have disabilities are able to walk or move seamlessly about. I apologize, my dog is barking there. Parks, how do we create parks? How does transportation play a role in ensuring that there's parks and green spaces available and trees that will include a community? And then also you've seen in the last 15, 20 years is bike lanes. And bike lanes in our roadways as well. They're in communities where there's lots of impervious surfaces, because we recognize also that vehicles are not the only thing using the roadways anymore. So, and then finally, the newest thing that is hitting us really easily is these emission-free plug-in vehicles. And so those, you're beginning to see those in more urban areas as well. Again, it may be cost prohibitive, but if you can have vehicles that are driving around that are emission free, such as many of the buses that we have now, it helps out a whole lot. So how do we consider, connect, and correct transportation and communities? A lot of people are doing, a lot of transportation agencies are committing to equity and transforming communities. So mitigating urban heat islands that is caused by impervious surface. Not only is there a significant runoff on them, but it also heats communities, particularly in the summertime, causing over a 30% increase of strokes for people, heat strokes, and for people in urban areas. A good example of what's happening in the District of Columbia, the Department of Transportation is funding the urban, they have grants for urban forestry. And so they're looking for ways in which the community could apply grants to cooling strategies by increasing more trees in areas. They're giving funding for green roofs, installing cool, mainly reflective roofs, using cool pavements that are either reflective or permeable when there's construction, and of course, utilizing smart growth practices. So we do see transportation, departments of transportation really committing to equitable solutions for their areas based on where they are. And there are many, many examples of this. The second thing is transit. We've seen transit make a fourfold. Not only do they provide transportation for people in these communities, they also are looking and they're taking it upon themselves to direct funding toward toward the purchase of low or no emission buses. That actually, their commitment is to reduce greenhouse emissions by 50% in a decade. This contributes to cleaner air in communities, which also contributes to less pollutants in the air. And it's particularly helpful because many people in brown and black and poor urban communities utilize buses. So there tend to be more bus routes in these communities. So they're actually having more traffic with them. So low emission to no emission buses is a good thing for correcting some of the transportation inequities that happen by providing access. So just to give you, I'm finishing up here. It's not going to take me very long, and I apologize for going over, but I did want to kind of shout out to the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission on our Clean Water Initiative and the efforts that we're making. We have several committees within the Turnpike to mitigate some of the runoffs that comes from our roadways. Expansions that we do now, that we are also connecting into tributaries such as the Susquehanna River through the runoff. So what you're looking at here is an example of what we've done. And we are attempting to achieve an MS4 system-wide permit, which develops really essentially a culture of environmental protection. The rocks that are here, when there's runoff from the roads or there's sediment that comes as a result of traffic or fuel or even salt and sand when we're treating the roads during snowstorms, they actually tend to get caught up in these rocks here, and the rocks actually cleanse the water before it goes into the culvert here that eventually leads to a tributary or a stream that eventually flows back into the Susquehanna River, which consequently flows into the Chesapeake Bay, where there are lots of species of wildlife that could be potentially impacted and could potentially hurt our ecosystem down the whole stream. So this is actually if you actually put your phone here, this is actually a QR code. So I do invite you to go and take a look at the Pennsylvania Turnpike's Clean Water Initiatives. I think we're doing really good work and really proud of our efforts to promote environmental justice on through our practices and our roadway practices. So as I had talked about earlier, the Build Back Better bill, Pete Buttigieg, he has placed equity at the core of any transportation initiatives. There's a $110 billion investment for transportation to repair and build roads and bridges. That's coming. We also want to ensure that we're mandating, he wants to ensure that there's a mitigation of climate change, and that safety is a major part of what we're using this transportation money for. So this is more of a diverse mixed bill, but there are a lot of transportation industries that is really excited about it. I also want to say just briefly, when we're looking at transportation in the future, what we have realized is that there are going to be less drivers out there. There's going to be so many different options in transportation that is not going to include you getting into a car, but rather you maybe doing a car share or riding with someone, using living in communities that are walkable, where you're able to walk and to or either to cycle to areas that you're in. So some of the future challenges and opportunity for transportation are being realized, and we recognize that these are some of the problems that we are going to, the challenges and then opportunities in the future. First, transportation industry is still white male dominated. We do know and understand that we must have increased diversity and persons of color in hiring in the transportation industry. We have been working on it by introducing students to internships for many years, but it's essential that we get those engineers and those who are designing projects into those roles to ensure that there's equity. It's just simple as that. When people have a little skin in the game, um, they tend to make decisions based on experience. Less people will be driving. We had talked about that earlier. Many of us, such as toll roads, that could be problematic. It may not be problematic. Some toll roads are looking at mixed forms of transportation. They also recognize, not in this area here because we're more of a rural highway system, but in Northern Virginia, they have rideshare programs where they have HOV lanes for transit. And there are also more walkable communities. And even in Colorado, there are roadways where there are bicycle paths that are traversing highway systems. So there are opportunities for multi-use of highway systems and particularly toll organizations. And the Turnpike is looking for different ways in which roadways can be used as well. Uh, Challenge. We all remember systems can always change back. How do we keep equity at the forefront of transportation decisions? We have to make sure that there's always equity at the core of everything that we do. So policy has to be driven to ensure that equity is at the head of transportation decisions and that it's being considered in every single aspect of it. Another outreach, another challenge that we're working on and we're ensuring and we want to commit to doing is outreach and input from communities using transportation. We and many other organizations are looking at how do we reach those communities so that we can get their input and gain their input with regards to transportation decisions. And so we're looking at innovative ways in which we can reach communities through social media, reach them on their phones through geofencing. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we're looking to do that in transportation industry as a whole. And then finally, the challenge of less siloed decision making. Are these decisions being made in one office by a few people or a couple of officials? Or are we able to ensure, opportunity wise, that we are able to collaborate with all of the locales that will help us to ensure that transportation meets all the needs of all the people? So it's essential that collaboration of city, state, and local entities are working together to create solutions for diverse transportation users. So just as I close here, I just want to say, and I do apologize, did go over a little bit, transportation can transform lives. Remember, we use transportation and it's something that surely will change our lives, but we have to be at the forefront to ensure that equity is always a part of how we move about in the world, because after all, mobility is what makes and shapes us in our society. So thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to at least address you about transportation equity. It's just a very small, broad section of it. So I hope you found it engaging. And I'm going to stop sharing right now.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you were going to say something else before I jumped
No,
in.
that is it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Miss Ojo. I thought that was wonderful. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I do see a lot of wonderful commentary. Anthony had chimed in that the Superfund sites is a case that he's witnessed where, you know, Black and brown people, as you spoke of, were the people who were often impacted by a community, you know, transportation being set in the center of their neighborhoods. So, you know, there was a lot of good commentary. If no one has anything else, I will pass along to Laura, Director of Communications, Laura Argenbright.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. That really was a lot of great information. Now we need to know more. You know, I feel like that was just such a scratching the surface, right? You do such amazing work. Just want to give everybody a chance. One last time. Any questions? You can just jump on verbally. Are we good? All right, then we'll call it a night. And again, thank you very much, Ms. Ojo, and everyone for attending this evening. Stay safe, stay warm, stay healthy, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.